Pivot tables help you summarize large data sets efficiently, but it can be difficult to interpret data when all you have to go on are the raw numbers. Charts summarize data visually, making it easier to distinguish groupings and trends in your data. Just as you can create charts based on regular worksheet data sets, you can create dynamic charts, called pivot charts, from the data contained in pivot tables. There are two ways to create a pivot chart. You can either create a pivot table and a pivot chart at the same time, or you can create a pivot chart from an existing pivot table. To create a pivot table and a pivot chart at the same time, you need to make sure that your source data, such as what I have here, is laid out as a data list or preferably an Excel table. Then on the Insert tab, click the Pivot Table button's down arrow and click Pivot Chart. When you do, the Create Pivot Table with Pivot Chart dialog box opens. You can then verify that Excel has identified the range properly, and in this case, it is a table named Table 1, and you can choose where to create the pivot table in Pivot Chart, and I will create it on a new worksheet. With those selections in place, click OK. After you create your pivot chart, you can arrange the fields using the controls in the Pivot Table Field List task pane, just like you would for a pivot table. So for example, if I want to display yearly revenues, I could create a column chart doing exactly that. Now I'll show you how to create a pivot chart based on an existing pivot table. To do that, you display a sheet that contains a pivot table, so I'll go to Sheet 3, click any cell in the pivot table, and then you simply create a chart as you would normally in Excel. You click the Insert tab, and then select the type of chart you want to create. In this case, I will create a column chart, so I'll click the Column button, and then just create a simple clustered column. And when I do, Excel creates a chart that reflects the organization of the pivot table. And again, you can pivot the pivot table to change the pivot chart. So for example, if I pulled the month field out of the Axis Categories area, then I would have a column chart with data for Firm A and Firm B in 2009 and 2010. Now there are some differences between regular Excel charts and pivot charts. The most important ones are that you can't switch the row and column orientation of the pivot chart by using the Select Data Source dialog box. That's not much of a problem though, because you can always rearrange your data by pivoting the pivot chart. Second, you can't create XY scatter charts, stock charts, or bubble charts. And finally, refreshing a pivot chart removes trend lines, data labels, error bars, and a few other less common settings. If you'd rather have your pivot chart reside on a separate worksheet from the pivot table, you can click the pivot chart, and then on the Design Contextual tab, click the Move Chart button, and then select where you want the chart to go. In this case, we'll put it on a new chart sheet, and we'll just leave the name as Chart 1 and click OK. I personally prefer a chart sheet because the pivot chart takes up an entire sheet and the larger area makes the chart easier to understand. Pivot charts enable you to summarize your data visually, providing an overview of your data and opening the door to insights you might not discover from looking at the raw numbers. You'll find that pivot charts are powerful tools that help you analyze your enterprise's data effectively.